Good morning, everyone. My name is James. I'm a minister here, and it's great to have you here, either in person or with us at home. And Liam, if you are watching at home, we see this another time. Well done. You did a great job with that reading. See a couple of proud grandparents in the back there. Let's give Liam a round of applause for his reading. First time he's done that. It's very great that we can have a range of ages and people from different backgrounds and all different sorts participating in our service, leading us all together in worship of God. Now, when I first became a Christian, first started taking it seriously, I'd hear other people say things like, I think God is saying to me, or I heard God say. And I don't know if you've heard similar things like this, but at the time, my thought was, what on earth does that mean? What does that look like? How do you know that that was from God? And if that is like you, and if you've ever had questions like that, the series we're starting today, running for the next 5 weeks, is exactly for you. It's called What is God Saying? And throughout it, we'll look at whether it is possible to hear from God. We'll look at whether it is possible to be confident with any sort of degree that what you think you're hearing actually is from God rather than just your own desires or fears projected out onto God. And we'll even look at some kind of ancient and contemporary practices, spiritual practices that people have used for discerning the voice of God. I'm confident that we will discover that far from being a fringe and unusual practice of a few weird Christians, that this idea, this habit of discerning where God is leading us, what he is saying to us, is open to everyone in a natural, down-to-earth, humble and easy way. As I said, it goes on for the next 5 weeks and the messages kind of carry into one another. And so if you wanted to follow along to all of those, we have a special page on our website dedicated to that you can follow along there. And I encourage you to have a look at that. There'll also be sermon notes and other helpful bits and pieces depending on the week. I also encourage you to consider joining a Connect group. This is probably the final day that you can consider joining up to one of those. Our Connect groups are 5-week small groups that will run throughout this series. The groups meet once a week throughout that time to catch up, discuss the sermon, and to pray for one another as well. And it is not too late for you to sign up for one of those. The very first one starts just after the service today, probably at about 11:15, depending on how long I speak for now. There you go, everyone's a bit nervous. I saw everyone shifting their seats at that comment. We also have one on Monday night, Tuesday during the day. We have one multi-gender, one for women, online, in person, everything like that. I encourage you to go look after the service in the foyer. We have some sign-up sheets. It is not too late, but after today, I don't know if I can say that again, today is the day to sign up. Now, just before we begin this morning, I invite you to pray with me. Our loving God, we thank you that you were already here with us. We thank you that before we thought of you, you thought of us. Before we desired you, you desired us. That everything we direct towards you is a response to your love and grace already with us. Please open up our hearts and minds. May we be aware of what you are saying to us this morning. May you draw us closer to yourself and transform us more into the likeness of your Son. In your name we pray. Amen. Learning to discern the voice of God is a great endeavour, and like any great endeavour, it requires groundwork. It requires preparation, foundations. Now, I could decide immediately after I finished today's sermon to go and run a marathon, and I'd be pretty confident if I started from here, I could make it at least to the corner of Shepherd's Hill Road. But if I wanted to go on and make it the whole 42.2 kilometres, which sounds a bit just thinking about it, I would actually need to do some preparation. I would need to lay some groundwork, wouldn't I? If I wanted to stand any chance of actually succeeding, I would need to do some preparation. And it's the same with discerning the voice of God. If we want to stand any chance of succeeding, if we want to give it the best shot we've got, it's not just about diving in straight away, it's about laying some foundations. And so this morning, we're looking at 3 different foundations. The first foundation is obvious, but it is worth making explicit. If you want to discern the voice of God, first, you have to believe it is possible to discern the voice of God. In order to discern the voice of God, you have to first believe it is possible to discern the voice of God. Now, I think this works in a secular sense as well as a spiritual sense. Just in a purely secular sense, we know this. Many years ago, when I first ran the City to Bay, the only reason I did it is because someone convinced me that it would be possible for me to do it. I don't think they really knew what they were talking about, but I believed them, and that's all that mattered. If you want to get that job, the only way you will get that job is if you first believe it is possible for you to get that job. If you want to become a great artist, the only way that you will is if you first believe it is even possible to become a great artist. This works on a purely secular, material level, but it also works on a spiritual level. For the longest time, Christians have described our engaging with the world, our seeking out truth, our growing as faith-seeking understanding. That is, if you want to discover something new or you want to grow, you don't start from a place of cynicism or a place of skepticism, because that just cuts you off from the possibilities. Instead, you start from the place of belief that God is good and has created this world to be understood and enjoyed, and it is beautiful and ordered and can be engaged with. And from that place of faith, that place of belief, you are then set free to actually discover the truth, to go out there and do inquiry, to grow from that position. Starting from a position of belief and faith isn't naive, it's realistic. And if we want to learn how to discern the voice of God, we've first got to believe that it is possible for us to do so. Thankfully, I think we have very good reasons to believe that it is possible for us to hear from God. We have good philosophical reasons. If you want to dive into this a bit further, the sermon that we gave on the 14th of February is probably the best one to look into that. You can go and look at it. But in short, this universe that we're a part of, full of its beauty and its order, the best way to make sense of it, the fact that it is here at all without giving any reason within itself to be here, is to understand that at every moment it is sustained by God. By every moment it is called forth by God to beauty and order. And if this is the nature of reality, God holding all things together, intimately involved in it, then it makes sense that we should be able to hear from him, that we can desire things because he calls us forth to desire, that we can understand things because his mind calls us forth to understanding. We are actually made to hear from God, to connect with him. We also have lots of good reasons from the biblical witness to think that it is possible to discern the voice of God. We see examples of people like St. Paul seeing in a dream the call of God to go next on his missionary journey to Macedonia, even though he had no particular reason to want to do that. We don't think that that would have come from himself. We see the elders of the church in Jerusalem having a sense from God that these new people coming into the faith who weren't Jewish should be able to come in without going through these rituals first. They heard from God this call to move on past the tradition that had been with them for generations, to welcome everyone in without exception. And I see no reason to think they would have heard that just from themselves, overcome that prejudice, that belief themselves. I do believe it was from God. And we see example of Jesus going to spend time with God, talking about hearing from God, discerning it. And we might forget it because these people are in the Bible, but these are just ordinary people. It's not like they're part of some sort of super spiritual race, or when they were born they got injected with some extra dose of spirituality that none of us have ever gotten. These are ordinary people like you and I who hear the voice of God, able to discern it. We also have good evidence, I believe, that it is possible to discern the voice of God from our own experience. Last week, we had Ben Rowe here to speak with us. A little while before that, he shared a video with us sharing his story of reading the Gospels and hearing God through the message of Jesus to be generous and to seek justice, leading him to form this street-light ministry that he's a part of to youth in his area. The first foundation to learning to discern the voice of God is to believe that it is possible. And although we don't have the sort of knockdown evidence that would make the most ardent skeptic happy, I think we have plenty of reason to believe it is at least possible. So my question to you as we go on this 5-week journey is, do you believe it is possible? In some circles, you actually look more intelligent by being a bit cynical at this point and saying, no, it's not doable, it's just people projecting things. I mean, there's no particularly good reason, it's just what the fashion is, but that's what happens in some circles. And so my question as we go into this for you is like, are you willing to give it a go, and do you believe that it is at least possible? That is the first foundation. The second foundation to learning to discern the voice of God is this: it's consistency. Again, if you didn't know already, I'm terribly sorry to break the news to you, but if you want to learn something or grow in any way or develop a new skill, I'm afraid you need to be consistent at it. It is not possible to lose weight by putting the dressing on the side of the salad once a year. However, if anyone here knows how to do that, let's all write the book together and make millions. It is not possible to learn French by travelling to France for a week once every 2 years. It's not possible to become a more generous person by just giving a donation every year on the 30th of June. If you want to grow in any skill, you need to be consistent to do it. And it is the same with learning to discern the voice of God. If you want to learn to discern the voice of God, it needs to become not just something you pull out every once in a while, but a practice, a habit, day to day, week to week, month to month. See, there's kind of two reasons why, actually, let me just say quickly, that if we just pull it out when we need to make a decision once every 6 months or when we're in something wrong, it won't work. There's kind of two problems for this. One is if we just pull it out once every 6 months when there's a big decision to make or a problem, we'll be rusty at it. It will be like when I suddenly bump into someone who can speak Arabic and I haven't used my Arabic in a year, it doesn't go particularly well. But the bigger problem is something like this. If we only turn to God, if we only turn our attention to God when we have a problem or we're trying to make a decision, then are we really that interested in actually hearing from God? If that's our habit, if that's how we use discerning the voice of God, if we're honest with ourselves, I think we'll find that what we actually want isn't to hear from God. What we want is some sort of divine GPS or some sort of divine butler, some divine problem fixer. If we are actually interested in hearing from God, we will do it day to day. It's almost like by definition, to hear from God is to do it frequently, in the good times and in the bad, when you feel like it and when you don't, when you find it rewarding and when it isn't rewarding. When you do it like that, it is springing out of a desire to actually follow after God, to have him shape your life, to be near to him, not just to have him fix your problems. A little while ago, I was listening to a podcast. It was someone was interviewing a senior minister at one of these big churches, really busy guy, and he was talking about his work-life balance. He was critiquing the idea that if you're really busy, you can still have a good relationship with your children by spending quality time with them. You might not be able to see them that often, but when you do see them, make sure you really make the most of it in doing something special. He was saying that he thought that was rubbish. His argument was that quality time is quantity time when it comes to kids. His reasoning was this, is that you can't schedule in which day it's going to be when your child really needs you. You can't plan ahead which basketball game they're going to score their first goal at and make sure you make that one even if you can't make the rest. You can't figure out which bedtime it will be that they're feeling anxious and need your help and make sure you're around for that. And so, if you want quality time with your children, so he said, it's about quantity time. It's about making 9 out of 10 bedtimes. It's about being at every basketball game. It's about driving them to and from school. He was saying this, that if you only spend time once a month with your child and you maybe do something special, take them out to the movies, you're communicating to them, I love you, but my work and my hobbies are really important. Whereas if you spend time with them day to day, week to week, in those special moments and in the mundane moments, you communicate, I love you and you are important to me. And it's something similar to when it becomes to us spending time with God and learning to discern the voice of God. When we turn to God just once every year when there's a big decision to be made or a problem that we face, we're inadvertently communicating, I love you, and I really like that you can fix my problems. Whereas when we seek to do it day to day, week to week, as a lifestyle, as a habit, we communicate and we move out of this desire for our love for God. And then we love being with God and being directed by God all the time. When it comes to consistency in spending time with God in spiritual practices, I think often of the great and lovely spiritual director and pastor Eugene Peterson. Peterson suggests that if you want to look at spiritual disciplines, it's good to do it, as most of the church has done for most of its history, as seeing some of them as non-negotiable. Things you do not just because they benefit you or because you like them, but because they are good and they are time spent with God, like putting the kids to bed or taking them to school, these sort of non-negotiables. He suggests that there are 3 things that the church in particular, and you might want to consider this if you want to grow in your consistency, 3 things that the church has seen as these non-negotiables. The first is this: spending time with God and listening to God in weekly worship, as you're all doing right now. The second is this: spending time with God and listening to God by reading a psalm a day, not just to understand it, but to hear God from it. And the third is this: listening to God and spending time with God by praying moment to moment. As you have some sort of pain or grief, praying, God help. As something good happens in your day, you spend some time with a friend or a child or something like that and it's exciting, saying a prayer of thanks. Praying to God moment to moment, these 3 non-negotiables as a way of fostering consistency. That is our second foundation. If we want to grow in our ability to discern the voice of God, we need to be consistent. Not just because, like any other skill, if you're not consistent, you'll be rusty and it's hard to do it. But also by nature, to want to hear from God, to follow after him, to be shaped by him, is to want to do it consistently, not just when you quote unquote need it. Our third and final foundation for learning to discern the voice of God is to grow in our desire for God and in an indifference of heart. To learn to grow in our desire for God and in an indifference of the heart. Our greatest barrier when it comes to learning to hear the voice of God isn't the fact that God rarely speaks audibly, or that we don't know what it looks like, or our lack of skill. Our biggest barrier when it comes to learning to discern the voice of God is us. Our biggest barrier is our core fears and shame and our strongly held beliefs and desires. Like, it makes sense when you think about it. If you really, 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 really want to go on this holiday, you're actually far less likely to spend some time in prayer before God and ask, should I go on this holiday? If you're really, really, really confident about your political beliefs or your theological beliefs, you're less likely to sit down before God and ask for direction on a tricky topic because you think you've already got the answers sorted out anyway. And you might be a little afraid that you hear something different from God as you do that prayer. You know, as I was actually sitting down to write this part of this sermon on Friday, I was feeling a little bit off about how it was going, not sure what I should do. And I thought to myself, a thought come into my head, well, I should sit in silence and pray and see if I hear anything. Maybe God might direct me in a different direction. And immediately another thought jumped into my head. You've got sermon notes to write up and a bunch of Connect group questions to get out. People are waiting for you to get it done and the day's ticking on. No, you don't have time to do that. What if God told you to scrap the whole thing and you had to start again? Best not to listen to God, just get on with writing. Another ironic, somewhat, example of how these fears we have can cut us off from hearing God. These things, our shame, our fears, our strongly held beliefs and desires can cut us off and stop us from coming before God to hear from him because we don't want to hear out of fear that we might lose something we wanted or be drawn into doing something that scares us. Even worse though, sometimes these things don't stop us from hearing God altogether, They just distort what we hear from God. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but it's a bit sad, really. There was a large number of Christian ministers in the States, kind of often from a more charismatic background, who 6 months ago predicted with confidence, said from their pulpits that God had told them that Donald Trump would be re-elected as President of the United States. Do you know what? I take no happiness in their awkwardness. It's just horrible all around what they did to their people and the whole situation. But in case you didn't know, Donald Trump wasn't re-elected. And so it's pretty clear at this point that they were mistaken, that God didn't say this. And as we look on it from this point of view, I think we have to acknowledge that what had happened is that their fears, their shame, their strongly held beliefs, their strongly held desires had distorted what they had heard from God. They strongly desired for Trump to be re-elected. So when they got a sense from God that everything is going to be okay, they interpreted that as Donald Trump is going to be re-elected. They strongly believed that only a Republican president could be a Christian president, could be good for God. And so when they heard from God that he is sovereign over all, they interpreted that as the Republican must be elected. They had this fear of what a democratic president would look like. Would he take away their rights and all this sort of stuff? And so they interpreted the comfort from God as assurance that there would be no democratic president. And they had been up in front of their church supporting Trump, saying that he was their man, all these sort of things. And so out of fear of shame, when they were alone with God, they willed themselves to hear that he would be elected. All of these things didn't just stop them from hearing what God was saying to them, but distorted what they were saying. So the question is this: if our fear, shames, strongly held belief and desires can either stop us from hearing God or distort what he is saying, then what do we do about that? Well, the answer that has often been suggested throughout the history of the church is this: to grow in our desire for God. There's a group called the Ignatians that were particularly focused on this. When it came to hearing from God, discerning his voice, they wouldn't just jump in straight away, willy-nilly, big prayer service, anything like that. They would start by entering into silence and contemplation and reflection. They would start by examining themselves. They would start by looking at their deeply held desires and beliefs and their fears and their shame and offering them up to God. Saying to God, these are things that might keep me from you, might keep me from hearing from you. As hard as it is for me to do so, I offer them to you. I want to desire you more than anything else. I want to know that your love that drives out all fear. I want to be confident in your acceptance of me that removes any shame. They would turn their hearts toward God, and so their desire for God would grow and free them from all these other things that would trap them. Their aim and hope was to achieve a state that they would call the indifference of the heart. A heart that was so filled with love and desire for God that it was somewhat indifferent to the circumstances of life. Didn't care as much about which job they were in, that one or that one, whether they had this partner or that one or none at all, whether they went on this holiday or didn't go on it, because they were so confident that wherever they were, they would be with God, and that was the most important thing anyway. This indifference of heart is a little bit like being so excited about going on a date with someone that you fancy that you don't really particularly care which restaurant you end up at, even if you really do kind of like that one more than that one, because either way, you will be with them, and that is what is most important. This is the third foundation for learning to discern the voice of God, to grow in desire for God and this indifference of heart. We all know that these things, our desires for things of this world, our fears, our shame, these things can keep us from hearing God. We're a little bit like the children of Israel in the desert. who were so afraid of dying in the desert and so desired to be back home. Even if they were slaves, they knew that life and it was, as comfortable as they could hope for, that they refused to listen to God, who was just about to lead them into the promised land. And that's where we can sometimes be. We're so afraid that God might say, don't go for that promotion, or don't buy that house, or don't do this, or don't do that, that we miss out from hearing something from him that actually would lead into greater joy and greater peace and greater love. The final foundation, growing a desire for God and an indifference of heart. They're the three. Believing it's possible, consistency, and growing in desire for God. I'm actually going to give you some homework for those who want to do it. You have to hand it in by 9:55. No, I'm kidding. For those of you who want to, your homework is this. And in some ways, starting off week 1, it's actually quite a hard one to do. But if you can do it, I think it will be very rewarding. It's 5 to 10 minutes a day, morning or night, whichever is best for you, to try out that Ignatian practice. To come before God in stillness, in quietness. If you've got kids, try 3 a.m. And explore with God. What are these deeply held desires and fears and shame and beliefs within me? And as they come up, just offer them to God. Say, I don't know how to handle these myself, but I know that I want to grow my desire for you. Please be at work in me.